In this video, I'm going to go over a very important concept, which is known as inverse functions. Inverse functions. So we already understand what a function is. A function is something that has an input and an output. All right? The inverse function is the exact opposite. So let me explain that through an analogy. Say, for example, you're making an iPhone. So you're making an iPhone, okay? You're making an iPhone. So in order to make an iPhone, well, you need a couple of things. You need some inputs, right? You need some things that sort of need to be built to go into an iPhone. So for example, one of the first things you might need is glass. You need the glass for the front cover. You need some glass. You don't need. Then you probably need like some plastic, because obviously there's some plastic. You need some metal, right, for the back casing, or the old ones. You probably need some computer chips. So these are chips, some computer chips. And of course, you need a lot of software, right? You need a lot of software. You need a lot of code in order to go through that. And of course, there are a million other things. I'm just going to write etc. But all these inputs go into making the iPhone. And remember, our inputs, we call them X. So I'm going to write them as X over here. So all these inputs are sort of gone into a machine. And then that machine, what it spits out is obviously the output. It's the output. And remember, we call outputs as Y, or we also say that's equal to f of x. Right? And this ends up being the iPhone itself. All of this combines into the iPhone. And so I'm just going to draw a little picture of an iPhone. It's obviously not the best picture, but there you go. So all of this sort of combines into making the iPhone. Now, what we want to do sometimes is something known as reverse engineering. If you've ever heard of the concept of reverse engineering, what it means is you start with a final product. Let's say you have a phone, or you have like a piece of or some software that's running, or basically you end up with the final product. And what you want to figure out is what actually makes up that product. What are the internal inputs that make up the product? In this case, you need to do something known as basically finding the inverse. And the inverse is the exact opposite of what's going on here. In the inverse function, what we do is we start with the output. Basically, we're switching the inputs and outputs. So we start off with our final product. So in this case, let's say we have the iPhone. And what we're doing, right? So what we're doing is we're sort of unscrewing it, opening it up to figure out what's it made up of. And that's where we find out, oh, obviously there's some glass, there's plastic, right? There's metal. There are, the computer chips, there's batteries, there's software, right? And so many other things that go into make the iPhone. And so the inverse function is really just doing the opposite of what a function is doing. In other words, what was the output now is the input, and what were the inputs is now the output. All right? So this is basically the basic premise of an inverse function, where all we're doing is switching the inputs and outputs. In the next example, I'm going to go through, or in the next video rather, I'm going to go through some notation, and then in the forthcoming videos, I'll show you some examples of how we do this for some basic functions that we already know. See you in the next video.